Welcome to the Author Your Life podcast, where you can write a new script for your life and become the hero of your story. I'm your host, David McRae. You are the author of your life. Let's get started.
All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you.
In my experience, there's no such thing as luck.
It is not our abilities that show what we truly are. It is our choices.
Hello, Story Changer, and welcome back to the Author Your Life podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be presenting a piece of training that comes from my upcoming book, Author Your Life, Become the Hero of Your Story. In the weeks leading up to the book's release, and indeed in the weeks just after the book's release, I'm going to be delivering pieces of training that come from the book. So this might be a concept, it might be a strategy, a habit, a tool, a technique that's geared around making a significant change to a key portion of your life. You can enjoy a number of these trainings throughout the weeks and months to come, all coming from my brand new book, which is available for pre-order right now on Amazon. So if you enjoy this training and you think the rest of the book will be equally as useful to you, then make sure you head over to Amazon and pre-order your copy so you get it as soon as it's released. But whilst you're waiting, I'll leave you to enjoy this piece of training that comes from the book. Hello, Story Changers, and welcome back to another episode of Author Your Life. Today, we're going to be talking about how to deal with negative people. Now, I'm sure you have them in your life, people who bring you down, who sap the energy out of you, who frustrate you and annoy you. And these are the people we're going to be looking at today. Because ultimately in life is all about contrasts. We meet some good people, we meet some not so good people, we meet some people who are somewhere in between. You aren't going to cleanse your life of negative people. So you have to learn how to deal with these people who come up in your life. And that's what we're going to cover in this episode. And what I'd recommend doing right off the bat is to write yourself a list. And on this list, write yourself the names of the 20 people you spend the most time with, in rough order of number 1 being the person you spend most time with, number 20 being the person you spend the least time with. Now, this doesn't have to be an exact science, you don't have to count up the number of minutes for each person, but make a rough guide. You'll know roughly who your top 5 are as opposed to who your bottom 10 are. And once you've written down every single name, I'd like you next to that person's name to write either a plus sign or a minus sign. Is that person overall, in the grand scheme of things, a positive influence in your life or a negative influence in your life? So what you have after you've completed this task is the list of the 20 people you spend most time with, and whether that person is overall a positive or negative influence in your life. Now, you might have a list of 20 people who are all positive influences in your life, which is amazing, that's wonderful. You don't need to watch the rest of this video. But I suspect for 99.9% of you who are watching this, you won't have 20 pluses on that list. There's going to be some negatives. There are going to be some people who overall aren't the best, most empowering, most enlightening, most inspiring influence on your life. How do we deal with these people? Well, there's a couple of stages and steps to work through. And first of all, as you look at this list, maybe you don't have to deal with these people at all. If you're looking at these names and you see that most or all of the negative influences are in your bottom 10, then maybe this isn't something to be hugely concerned about. These might be people that you see once in a while at work, maybe they're a friend of a friend, maybe they're a mother-in-law that you see every couple of months or so. Maybe this isn't someone that you have to deal with or do anything more than just accept the time that you do have to spend with them and don't allow whatever negativity they bring into that interaction, into that relationship, to affect the rest of your life. So the first step is, actually, if you have a group of 5, 10 really positive people who you spend lots of time with, then you don't need to worry about the other negative people in life. Because yes, you're going to meet them, but they don't have to be a sap on your energy. You don't have to take on their negativity. So the first step is, if you find that the negative people on your list are much nearer the bottom and you're spending much less time with them, there's not necessarily anything that you actually have to do. Now that's the easiest scenario. Now, what about if some of these negative influences are starting to rise higher up the list? Or alternatively, maybe you've got a large cluster of negative influences that you don't necessarily spend that much time with individually, but collectively they're proving to be quite a drag. So work would be the prime example of this. You actually have a cohort of people at work who you don't spend that much time with individually, but collectively you're constantly feeding off their negativity and it's impacting you. Or perhaps there are 1 or 2 people who are slightly higher up the list who you're spending more time with, who are also negatively impacting you. So how can we look at this? Well, let's take that first scenario that I listed. Having a large cohort of people who you don't spend that much time with individually, but collectively is a different story. If that's the case, then you need to look at how much time you're spending in that particular environment. If it's an environment at work, say it's a department in your office or your company or your corporation or your business, then perhaps you need to consider how much time that you're spending in that department. Maybe there's different options for you. Maybe you can reallocate work to spend less time in that department. Perhaps you can ask for a transfer. Perhaps you want to take a new step and have a career transition. Now, I'm not saying to base career choices purely just over having a few negative Nancys in the office, but these are things to consider, where if you feel an environment you're constantly going into is negative and a drain on you, think about how you can change that environment to change the amount of time that you spend in that environment. To take a different scenario, maybe it's a case of the people who you go to the bar with on a Friday night aren't really that good for you. All they do is they moan about their week, they moan about their work, they moan about their relationships, they moan about their health. And actually, they're not the people who you really want to be spending your Friday nights with. Perhaps there's a different group of people that you want to be spending your Friday nights with, and perhaps doing something other than going to that particular bar with those particular people is something you want to consider. So that's the first step. If you've got a large cohort, a group of negative people, think about how you can change the environment and change your time that you spend with that cohort, and perhaps start replacing a few of those negative people with some positive people in another environment. So that's the first scenario I listed. Now, what if it's no longer just a group of people who you spend a limited amount of time with and you can easily change the environment, or somewhat easily change the environment to spend less time with them? What if we're starting to talk about people higher up the rung? If we start talking about having negative people in your top 10, then these people are going to be either friends or family. Because even if you're spending a lot of time with people at work, if you're spending that much time that someone's in your top 10, then you probably have some kind of friendship with that person as well. So they might be a friend who's at work, they might be a friend that you know from outside of work, they might be a family member. Once we start looking at that top 10, then what we're really saying is that these are people who you've chosen to be in your life. Sometimes we can't do that much about the people that we work with, but we certainly choose who we allow into our life as friends and family. So this requires a slightly different approach and a slightly different look at things. If you've got someone who's a negative influence and they're high up your list and you're spending a lot of time with them, then again there's a sequence and steps to work through. Now, what some people in the field will say, and to be honest, what I would have said a year, 2 years ago, is that you just cut these people out. If someone is a negative influence in your life, just cut them out. You don't have time to be dragged down by people. You don't have time for the energy vampires in life. And I do agree that's true. But I think there's some steps to take before you go for that option. And that's where, for me personally, I haven't necessarily had the nuance in the past where I could be quite ruthless with deciding that somebody wasn't a good influence and cutting them out of my life. Now, I still can be ruthless if required. If I do feel that somebody is a negative influence and there is no point investing in a relationship that's failing and bringing me down. But I think there's some steps to go through before you get to that decision point, and it's these steps that I'm going to talk about with you just now. First of all, if you have someone in that top 10, a friend or a family member, there are elements of a good relationship there. There are elements of being a loving family member. There are elements of being a trusted friend. There is a certain chemistry that pulled the two of you together. Now, in the case of family, this might be purely just because you lived with someone, you lived with a parent or a sibling, whatever it might be. But certainly more so in the case of a friend, that is somebody who you definitely brought into your life based on a decision that you made. Now, what sparked that good relationship is still there. Now, sometimes what sparks a good relationship can be beyond repair, or it can have evolved and moved on and you've gone in different directions. But this isn't always the case. So the first step I recommend is sitting down with this friend or family member and having a discussion with them, being open and honest with them, and start talking about the situation. Start talking about how you feel that the relationship hasn't been going so well recently, that there's been a lot of negativity in the relationship for whatever reason. And start to talk through why is this? What's going on? And is there anything that we can do in this relationship to improve it? And what you'll find a surprising number of times is how much the other person will reciprocate that. Because ultimately they want to have a good relationship with you too. They don't want a relationship to be negative. None of us want to have a negative relationship. We want to have positive relationships. And when you sit down and have this type of discussion, there is the possibility of salvaging a relationship, looking at the things that have gone a little bit astray or a little bit wrong and correcting them. Perhaps you can set some new practices, some new principles, some new rules and guidelines and boundaries within that relationship that ultimately improves it and turns that negative into a positive. That is an available option for you, and take that option first before you start thinking about any other sort of long-term actions and reactions. Try to make the relationship what it once was first. Always do that as a first step. Now, I can already hear some of you saying, oh yes, that's all well to say, David, but I can't just sit and talk with my mother-in-law like that. She doesn't listen. Or I can't sit and talk with my husband like that. They just don't listen. Still go through the process. That way you can say to yourself that I've done everything that I can. And maybe you might actually be surprised at how reciprocal your mother-in-law or your husband ultimately proves to be if you go into this process with real openness and earnestness. So try that first. Now what happens if you've tried that, it doesn't work, it's something that you've been trying for a long time? What do you do next? Well, here we've got a couple of options. First of all, if you're looking at someone who's a friend, friends are people who we've chosen. You made a decision, a choice, to bring that person into your life at some point. Now you recognize that that is no longer a good choice. It is no longer a good choice to keep them in your life. So you have the right to also make a choice to not have them in your life. Now that can be a difficult choice to make, but ultimately that is on you. You get to decide if that person stays in your life, and you get to decide if that person no longer gets to stay in your life. Now this can be a difficult thing to do, especially if you have a group of friends. Sometimes it's not so easy to say, okay, I'm just going to cut out that one friend, but I'm going to keep all the rest of the group. Because ultimately, you do a lot of group activities and there's all the interrelationships in the group that you've got to consider. And sometimes it's not as easy as just cutting one person out of a group and spending time with all the other people who you still like in the group. I understand that. But there are ways just to minimize the amount of time you spend with a person. You get to choose, okay, I'll spend time in this group, but I'm not spending time with that individual. That person is not someone I want to give my time and attention to. I will give my time and attention to other people in the group, even if we happen to be in the same physical space as each other. And this is something that you get the choice to do. Now, it can be easier, and it's certainly preferable, to be able to cut someone completely out of a group, spend no time with them, and ultimately never see them again if you feel that the relationship is really not working and it's negative. This is something that I've had to do with 2 people in my life where I've just said, I can't see them again. I can't be in the same room as them. I can't be in the same conversation with them. And if that happens, things aren't going to turn out well. I've had to do that with 2 people, and I know it's not easy. And I know it's not easy because that exact scenario that I've just described to you is in place in my friendship group. Just because I've made a decision to not have a relationship with these 2 particular people, there are still interrelationships that are going on and happening where my friends are still friends with the people who I've chosen to no longer be friends with. It can get complex and confusing, but ultimately you get the choice to say, that's someone that I don't want to spend time with. Ultimately, they are a negative influence in my life. This relationship has not been repaired, and you get to move on. That is something that we can always do with friends. Even if you have that slight group dynamic that makes things a little bit trickier, you can still have the option to do that. Family, on the other hand, perhaps a little more complicated, because family are not a choice. Family is given to you. Your parents are given to you. You don't choose them. Your siblings are given to you. You don't choose them. Your extended members of the family are given to you. You don't choose them. Even your children, whilst you choose to have children, ultimately you don't have any guarantees about exactly who they're going to be and how they're going to grow up. You don't get to choose between different types of children and which one you prefer. You get the child that is born to you. So family, there's a lot less choice in the matter. But actually, you still have the same right as you do with your friends. One thing that I believe strongly is that genetic relatedness does not equal loyalty. Just because someone shares a certain percentage of genes with you doesn't mean you're under any kind of obligation to have a relationship with them. There's a huge number of my family, to be honest, that I don't speak to and I don't spend time with because they don't share my values. They're not the type of people that I want to be around and be in my company. In fact, if I look at my adopted family and my in-laws, there's far more people in my married family who I feel much closer to and who I feel are much more family than my biological family. Genetic relatedness does not equal loyalty. It's about the values you share, about the connection and chemistry that you have. And if you feel you don't have this with certain family members, then again, you have the decision to not spend time with those family members. Now, this may well end up being cutting someone out of the picture completely. Sometimes you can do that, and sometimes that's what happens with families. But I recognize and respect that that's not so easy. We talk about the poor stereotypical mother-in-law. We've done that a couple of times in this video. You can't say to your mother-in-law necessarily, I don't want you to spend time with us as a family. I don't want you to see your grandchildren. I don't want you to see your child. But you can choose how much time you spend with your mother-in-law. You can choose to say, I'm not investing any time and attention in my mother-in-law. Yes, she still might be on the scene physically. Yes, she might still be coming along to visit her child, to visit her grandchildren. But I don't have to invest anything into a relationship that's ultimately a negative one. Now that can have some more complex chemistry that you might end up discussing with your partner and possibly even with your children as well. So that is not necessarily an easy situation, but you still get the choice about time and attention. And sometimes it's just a case of drawing up some stronger boundaries. Maybe that mother-in-law just needs some boundaries. Maybe that sibling just needs some boundaries. Maybe even that child just needs some boundaries where you say, the dynamic of our current relationship has not been working. We need to look at improving this relationship and ultimately setting some boundaries so that this relationship can have some level of functionality. Because we're going to be seeing each other, we're going to be spending time with each other, we need to work out a way to make this relationship work, even though it's perhaps not the best one. So this is how you go through a process of dealing with negative people. Ultimately, looking at the people you spend time with, maybe negative people aren't anyone that you need to deal with at all. It's just a case of not allowing their energy and their negativity to encroach on you. Perhaps it's just a case of an environmental change where you spend less time in an environment that has a cluster of negative people and swapping that environment for something more positive. Maybe it comes down to having some frank and honest discussions with people who you aren't doing so well with, who are having a negative influence in your life, and ultimately repairing and renewing that relationship. And sometimes this may be just a case of detaching from that person, not investing your time and energy in that person, and perhaps that takes you all the way to cutting someone out of your life. Sometimes that is the best option for you. Sometimes that's the option you have to take for your well-being and for your fulfillment in life. But that is at the end of a process. Work through the process first. Do everything that you can to improve and renew a relationship. And if that doesn't work, then you can take the more extreme measures. And that is how you can deal with negative people. To look at the people in your life and turn the relationships you have with them into more positive relationships. Because one of the strongest findings in science and social psychology is that good relationships are one of the key factors of health and the key factors of happiness. You need to have these good relationships in your life. You can't afford to have negative people bringing you down. People who criticize, people who judge, people who moan and complain. You want people who are uplifting and inspiring, because you can't count on being uplifted and inspired all the time. But when you have positive people around you, then they make sure that you never get too down. They are the ones who support you, enliven you, empower you, and those are the people who you want in your life. Those are the people that you prioritize your time and attention for. So folks, I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I look forward to sharing more with you, as always, in the future. But until next time, remember that you are the author of your life. You hold the pen, and you can write whatever script you want for yourself. I'll speak to you soon. David. I'd like to tell you about my book, Author Your Life, Become the Hero of Your Story. This is a book for people who are at a crossroads in life and want to make a fresh start. Judging by the fact that you're listening to this podcast, I suspect that you may well be one of those people. This book is going to help you to change your narrative and rewrite the scripts in life that are holding you back. This book covers the latest science and research showing you how to become the person you want to be and live the life that you want to live. I'd like to invite you to get this book, not only because I feel it's a great book that's going to help you, but also it's going to support the podcast as well. I love podcasts, but sometimes all of those ads that you get can be really irrelevant and annoying when you just want to listen to a good piece of training or a good interview. So I therefore made the decision with my podcasts that number one, I wanted my podcast to be free so that everyone could listen to it. And number two, that I wasn't going to fund it through all these annoying and irrelevant adverts and commercials. Therefore, if you want to support the podcast and support all the things that I put out there for free, whether it be here on the podcast, my YouTube channel, other areas on social media, then buying a book is going to enable and help that process. So this is what we call a win-win scenario. By buying the book, you help to support my work and all the free stuff that I put out there, and you also get a really transformational book that's going to help you make those changes that you really want in your life. So if you feel you're someone who's at that crossroads in life, you're looking for a new direction, you're looking for a fresh start, then make sure you get this book. Author Your Life, Become the Hero of Your Story is available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Whatever your preferred medium, it's there for you to go get right now. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it hugely if you could head over to iTunes and leave a rating and review for the podcast. With your review, please be as honest and detailed as you can be, because with honest and detailed feedback, that helps me to adapt and grow this podcast to most serve you, the listener. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, then make sure you subscribe to the podcast. That way you aren't going to miss any of the future episodes that we've got lined up for you. Until next time, remember that you are the author of your life. You hold the pen, and you can write whatever script you want for yourself. So go out today and write yourself a beautiful story.